Hi, everyone, and welcome to Dear Katie, the podcast that amplifies courageous voices and real stories of resilience, healing, and hope after trauma. Katie Koestner was the first woman to speak out publicly as a survivor of date rape. In the early 1990s, she appeared on the cover of Time magazine, sparking a nationwide conversation about the realities of sexual violence. She is the founder of the Take Back the Night Foundation and the host of the Dear Katie podcast. Inspired by the many letters Katie has received over the last 20 years, each week, Katie interviews survivors, healers, and experts to honor their stories and explore the many paths to healing and hope. Before we begin, please know, many episodes of Dear Katie cover sensitive topics related to sexual violence, trauma, and recovery. Listen with care and take the space that you need to take care of yourself. Your well-being is what matters most. Now, let's join Katie and today's guest for a conversation that matters.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Dear Katie podcast. This is obviously Katie Koestner, and I'm so delighted to have all of you with us as we continue in our healing journeys. Each and every episode should hopefully give you another path, another idea, another way to find some strength, find some colleague out there who you didn't know existed, some resource. And today should be no different. We are so delighted to host Sophie Maddocks. And remember, always self-care is important. Push pause at any time. But I'll share a little bit about Sophie. But we are also not only hosting Sophie today, but my amazing Catrina is on with us. And Catrina has been on the podcast team for quite some time, usually behind the scenes. But today she's in front of the camera as well. So I will have Catrina, you should share a little bit about you after I introduce Sophie. So Sophie Maddocks is an expert on digital abuse with 12 years of experience working across schools, universities, and nonprofits. As a former high school teacher, guidance counselor, and youth worker, Sophie is passionate about collaborating with young people to navigate the challenges of growing up online. So thank you, Sophie, for coming to the podcast. And Catrina, share a little bit. Most of our listeners don't know you nearly so well as they should.
Yeah, sure thing. So my name is Catrina Aglubat, and I have been a volunteer with the Take Back the Night Foundation, as well as the Dear Katie podcast for nearly a year at this point. And just a little bit about me. I am currently completing my post-baccalaureate years in psychology, and I really want to be a clinical psychologist one day, as well as taking part in academia. So I am so excited to be here today with Sophie and talking about a really important and I think really important topic that has relevance to multiple fields. So I guess what we can start with is to get a little bit more information about Sophie, just a little bit about her background, her education, and how she became interested in her field of expertise and career path.
Thanks so much, Catrina. And thanks, Katie. I'm really delighted to be here and sending all of my love and best wishes and support to all the amazing listeners of this podcast. So my kind of area of research, which is gender-based sexual violence online, originated from when I was working with young people as a high school teacher, and I started to see different ways that technology fed into classroom dynamics in sometimes really distressing and scary ways related to image sharing. So that's sometimes nude image sharing or sexualized image sharing non-consensually. So when that would begin to happen in the classroom, or students might talk about that happening outside the classroom, that was a huge area of concern for me. And although I continue to work with young people in a voluntary capacity, I went on to get my master's and PhD kind of researching in this area. And it's still something that I continue working on today.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. That's a really interesting path to, be witnessing something and then implementing that into your professional research interests. So to start, one of the topics that I feel really should be getting a wider audience is the concept that is commonly and mistakenly referred to as revenge porn. So how about we just start with explaining what it is, explaining why revenge porn is a misnomer for, as I mentioned before, image-based sexual abuse, and why is it more accurate to use that term over revenge porn?
I think that's a great place to start. When I talk to people about this topic, I often say, to large groups, hands up if you've heard of the term revenge porn, and usually everybody puts their hands up. And then I might say, hands up if you've heard of the term image-based sexual abuse, and I might get a few hands go up. And so I think there's still work to do to change our vocabulary to make it more survivor-centered on this topic. So when I talk about revenge porn, or the preferred term that I like to use, image-based sexual abuse, I'm talking about the non-consensual creation and distribution of explicit sexual imagery. So that could be the creation of sexual imagery using artificial intelligence. That could be the creation or distribution of sexual imagery using a secret camera, or that could be stealing or taking images that somebody's taken of themselves and distributing them without their consent. And so when I think about defining this harm, it's really about taking away someone's control over their body, right, and ignoring somebody's consent. And as I'm sure our listeners are aware of and can understand, that's why this is so deeply connected to other forms of sexual violence and sexual harassment that I'm sure are discussed on this podcast. And so the reason why we don't want to use the term revenge porn, first of all, because this isn't typically an act of revenge, right? So when we think about revenge, we think about somebody is doing something to get back at somebody who's originally hurt them, right? And in this case, it's very unusual to find an individual who's actually acting in revenge. Usually the thing that somebody's done wrong to be exposed is that maybe they broke up with their boyfriend, or maybe they decided they didn't want to go out with someone, or maybe they didn't do anything at all. They just happened to have their cell phone stolen and somebody found the images. So this idea of the word revenge is kind of victim blaming, because the person who's experienced revenge porn is going to say, hold on, I didn't do anything to deserve this. Why is it revenge? And I think just to kind of understand how this term came about, I think a lot of it is because it's predominantly men who perpetrate this harm. And so it's the idea that they maybe are seeking revenge against women as a whole, right? So it makes me think of the incel movement and things like that, this idea that men are trying to get revenge against women. But regardless of how it comes about, I think it's a really kind of confusing term that blames the victim. And then obviously it's the second word is porn, right? Revenge porn. And that's really concerning too, because it conflates what is actually a form of abuse into an entertainment product or a sexualized entertainment product like pornography. And so that the reason why I think it's important to have pornography in the conversation, in the discussion, is because a lot of forms of image-based sexual abuse, so a lot of images that are distributed, can end up on porn sites, right? So they can be consumed as if they're pornography, and somebody might consume video content thinking that it was made consensually by porn actors when actually it was made non-consensually. So it's important to bring conversations around the pornography industry into this, but it shouldn't be the term that we use to describe this harm, right? Because it's not entertainment, it's not pornography, it's a form of abuse. And I could go on about the problems with this term, but I'll stop there.
No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for drawing the difference between those two, Sophie. And I know that it's such a trite thing to say at this point, but language is really so important, and it shapes a lot of our understanding of culture and these obviously crimes that are being committed. So I think drawing a distinction between those two is so important, and yeah, kind of a good thing to start us off with.
Yeah, Catrina and Sophie, before you keep going, on that same point, I actually think it bears one more further question to you, Sophie, meaning I feel like sometimes we, especially in America, get very lazy with our language and we just, use the easiest catchphrase or catch term, and that's hence this term. What solutions do you have? I mean, we identify we want to shapeshift the use of language, but do you have any ideas about how to do that well?
That's a great question. I think it's really great to be as solution focused as possible when we're talking about
Hi, this is Katie Koestner, and I wanted to remind all of our listeners about the free National Sexual Assault Legal Hotline. We at Take Back the Night have assembled an incredible team of attorneys, trauma-informed, who truly believe survivors and want to support their journeys in healing and finding justice. The Get Justice Hotline is 567-SHATTER, or feel free to fill out a form on the Take Back the Night website, share your story, let the attorneys know what's going on, and they will get back to you as soon as possible with all of your legal options. That is a service we are delighted to provide through Take Back the Night. Because if you know me, Sophie, like I'm the one who like signed my name. I'm like, I'm out there. I want to get this word out there. I want to like really shake things up. And, I think the ivory tower is really important, but I think the streets and the grassy slopes out there are also really important to take the message into the people's mindsets.
Yeah, I think, narrow or misleading definitions, often definitions that originate in the news media, or in the case of revenge porn, in kind of tabloid media or media that's not particularly representing survivors' interests, it can lead to narrow solutions, right? So I think it's really important to change the terminology we use. And I think a key thing about that is thinking about the terminology that survivors want to use to describe what has happened to them, right? And so when we look at that more broadly and especially globally, because digital sexual harms transgress all national boundaries, right? Especially, we see different terms popping up in different parts of the world and among different constituencies. So there's always this challenge with terminology of we need to create a kind of catchy term that everybody understands that describes this harm, but it also needs to be clear enough that it accurately describes the harm so that our solutions are expansive enough to include all survivors. And so I really think the term image-based abuse is a useful term because it's not too long, right? And it includes the word abuse, which is central and crucial to what this harm is, right? This is a form of abuse. But there are lots of different terms that different people prefer. And so I think that is one challenge. But I think, the most important thing is when you're reporting on this topic, taking whatever terminology the survivor that you're talking to uses and then contextualizing that terminology and describing it. And so I think that's one thing that I try to do in my work and research, is to kind of draw from folks who are experiencing these harms and how they define them and experience them. There is such a broad range of terms. I've heard people refer to this as cyber rape. I've heard people refer to this as non-consensual image distribution. I mean, the kind of breadth of the terminology is really vast. And I think also an underlying factor is because we often don't know what to call harms that happen to women, right? It took a long time to come up with the term sexual assault. The history of the women's rights movement around sexual abuse and domestic violence has this complex history around naming things and understanding them and conceptualizing them. And that makes me think about the Me Too movement, right? And even the word Me Too and how that was able to be catchy and that was able to spread. So I think I don't have a specific solution, but I think, being open to different terminologies and drawing from the terminologies that kind of the experts on this harm are using is a good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sophie. And I guess going off of that, when you mentioned that it's kind of tough, or that society seems to kind of have some hangups about describing abuse and horrible treatment that so many women face, I think that we can shift gears a little and talk about what the role of sexism and the patriarchy is in image-based sexual abuse. As you mentioned before, it is kind of this transnational thing. And so not only in the US or what you consider like the Western world, but also places like the global South, etc.
Absolutely. I think to understand image-based sexual abuse in the same way that if we're ever trying to understand sexual violence, we have to understand sexism, racism, and imperialism, right? These drivers of owning and controlling women's bodies. And so, when I think about image-based sexual abuse in a global context right now, I'm increasingly thinking about what are the experiences of Palestinian women and girls right now. So, we saw the United Nations report just at the end last year concluding that, there were specific forms of sexual and gender-based violence that had become part of the Israeli forces' operating procedures, right? So this idea that sexual violence is also a tool of ownership over land, over people, over place. And then we saw those cases of Israeli soldiers taking photos and images of Palestinian women and girls' underwear, right? And posing with them and exposing them. And that, again, made me think about this idea of image-based sexual abuse and sexual abuse generally having to be understood in the context of sexism, racism, and imperialism to really be truly understood in terms of how it operates.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I think that, bringing up the role of image-based sexual abuse and how it's so inextricable from just violence in general, whether it's on this global scale, part of these conflicts between countries and ethnicities themselves versus just being between two people in the way that revenge porn may mistakenly give an impression of, I think is so important. And
yeah, I mean, if I can jump in there, I think, to speak to the connection, right, between the interpersonal and then the state level and the international level, right? When we create norms about women's role in society and women's bodies, those norms become part of interpersonal relationships, a romantic relationship, and become part of those wider kind of national conflicts. And in terms of the disproportionate distribution of this harm, we know that image-based sexual abuse targets younger women, single women. We know it targets people who are gender diverse or exist in different parts of the LGBTQIA spectrum. We know it targets racially minoritized individuals. We know, in different contexts, in different geographical contexts, there's been research around this harm disproportionately targeting Indigenous groups. So kind of understanding that wider demographic distribution of this harm really helps us to get to the crux of how it's operating as a tool of power and control, whether it's in a romantic relationship that's one-on-one, might not be romantic, but whether it's in a one-on-one relationship or whether it's at the role of kind of global politics and conflict. It's those similar desires for power.
Yeah, thank you for expanding on that. And sorry to shift gears so quickly, but just for some context, we don't have a ton of time in order to conduct this interview, but Sophie was so kind to carve some time into her very busy schedule in order to speak with us. But so speaking further about the consequences of image-based sexual abuse, image-based abuse, period, for victims, I wanted to speak more about how victims are impacted both on a material level, in the real world, as well as psychologically, because I think that's something that we haven't explored that much in the podcast, and I would love to bring some awareness about these consequences.
Absolutely. I think the term that comes up a lot when I've worked with other researchers and survivors in this space is that this is a kind of life-shattering or life-ruining harm when it happens in that moment, right? So you could be going about your normal daily life and then you suddenly get this notification or somebody suddenly messages you and says, hey, there's this nude imagery of you circulating, or you experienced a sexual assault and then you find out that it's been filmed and it's on a porn site, or, there's various different manifestations of that moment when this harm kind of becomes apparent to you, right? Or it could be that that you've been filmed and you're just waiting that maybe one day it's going to be uploaded, but you don't know, right? So there are so many different moments that are kind of the moment of the harm happening. And so they have these kind of huge impacts throughout the course of one's life. So an example of this would be survivors talk about experiencing PTSD and sexual trauma. And when you experience a physical assault, which in some cases, again, image-based sexual abuse can be born from a physical sexual assault, but sometimes not. But if you do undergo a physical sexual assault, in some cases you can get to a place of safety, right? In terms of psychologically distance from the perpetrator and things like that, or their location. Whereas with online harms, it's very hard to get to a point of psychological safety if you don't know who the person is who spread your information, you don't know how many people have access to it. It's the permanence of online spaces makes it difficult to delete. So in some ways, cybersexual violence has these kind of new aspects of sexual trauma to it, or these new kind of PTSD aspects around the permanence of the harm as it exists online, or it takes on its own life online, and how you manage that, right? So we have examples of survivors then having the economic hardships of maybe losing their job, maybe having to even change their name or move to a different place. You have the depression that comes with that, losing social ties, losing relationships. People report thoughts of suicide. There have been cases of people taking their own lives in response to this harm. And so this idea that one might not reach a place of psychological safety, I think, is a particularly compelling one to understand the severity of this harm and the new ways that it affects people. So one advocate who I've spoken to in the past, Adam Dodge from the End Tab organization, talks about this example of stalking, right? If somebody's stalking you in person, they might show up to your workplace or they might show up to your home. If somebody's stalking you online, when they show up at your workplace or your home, your colleagues might see them, right? Or your family might see them. When this happens online, how do you know who's doing it? You get an anonymous email, or you get there's this kind of different way that the fear can manifest and the harm can manifest in this way that can be kind of unknowable or can feel untreatable in that moment. So I think really understanding the ways that online spaces can exacerbate different forms of sexual violence is really important. So those are some of the kind of individual ramifications of this harm for survivors. But then, of course, there is the collective consequence of having technologies out there that can strip anyone virtually, right? So thinking about deepfake abuse and the use of AI technology. So what does it mean for us as a society? What are the consequences of the fact that anybody can be stripped naked? And we know that that has different connotations for women because women's bodies are shamed more in society. So, I'm thinking about the self-censorship that might cause, right? If a woman knows that she's more likely to experience image-based sexual abuse if she posts certain things online or if she enters public-facing roles in politics or journalism, what's the wider threat to democracy and free speech if we have these online harms that can be done in 5 or 6 seconds with the click of a mouse and can cause such extreme harm?
Hey everybody, it's Katie Koestner. Just a quick interruption. We want you to know that there is an entire shop full of cool merch on the Take Back the Night website to support your own healing journey, that of someone you care about. There are t-shirts, there's bracelets, there's glow-in-the-dark stuff. There's all kinds of unique special edition from our artist series as well. So please take a look if it's a holiday or a special occasion or just a gift to yourself. Support Take Back the Night through your purchase.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for touching on, I think, kind of like those new facets that are introduced by social media and the digitization of sexual abuse, how cybersexual abuse is both more private and anonymous, but at the same time a lot more public than what you would consider like a more traditional or physical kind of assault. Obviously not like comparing the two when it comes to their psychological impacts and on the individual and the collective level, but it's so important to not minimize the impact that cybersexual abuse does have. And yeah, so you did touch a bit on deepfakes and artificial intelligence as this emerging tool for image-based sexual abuse. So I was wondering if you could expand more on if there are any efforts by companies, the government, etc., to crack down on this. And if so, were there any debates or controversies surrounding these efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, well, just to pull up on one thing you said around, I also sometimes it can be challenging talking about digital and physical at the same time. But I think, just to emphasize how these two are so enmeshed.
Yes,
even as we're talking about like you were saying, even as we're talking about the differences with kind of the ramifications of cybersexual assault, the reality that folks who are leaving abusive or controlling relationships are almost undoubtedly likely to also be experiencing these threats around the distribution of their images, right? So this kind of like complete conflation in many ways of the physical and the digital, and also the physical symptoms that arise from being digitally sexually assaulted. So kind of understanding them together. And then in terms of the rise of deepfake image-based sexual abuse. So just to quickly define that for anyone who may not be familiar. So this is, the use of AI technology to generate sexually explicit images of people. And these images are extremely lifelike and realistic for folks who haven't seen them. And so this is something in 2017, there was the rise of this kind of face swapping app where the images and video content that, for example, adult film actors might create was then used to swap the face of the individual that you're trying to assault or embarrass onto the body of the adult film actor to create these fake pornographic videos or these fake nude videos. And then over the years that follow, the technology has become more and more and more adept and realistic. And now we have the AI generated version of this harm where essentially you can use text to image features, or you can create using a huge bank of images using AI tools, these very hyper-realistic nude sexual images of anybody. So just a quick kind of definitional grounding for that. And in terms of what's being done on that, I'm definitely not a legislative or legal scholar, so I probably can't speak to the specifics around different bills that are being passed at different levels in the US context around preventing the creation and distribution of deepfake sexual imagery. because I think that's a kind of fast moving space. So I don't want to say anything that is kind of factually inaccurate to the day. But I think in general, there has been a real concern. We've seen this rise also of AI child sexual exploitation material. So these images of minors being distributed in kind of really colossal amounts online. So I think there is certainly a sense of urgency around addressing this topic. I also think it's interesting taking a longer view on this topic, to think about how it's taken so many years to get traction and action and movement on image-based sexual abuse when it wasn't AI generated or AI facilitated. And now we see this kind of rapid attempts to address AI facilitated harms. So I think that does speak to kind of when new technologies come in, new senses of excitement or senses of potential around addressing these harms, but remembering that these harms are kind of long-standing, and regardless of what technology they use, they still cause really serious harm to victims. Aside from the legislative environment, I think because deepfake imagery, sexual imagery is emerging at the high school and the middle school level, and there are reports coming from schools that this is happening. I think increasingly there is a need at the school level for guidance and support, and this kind of digital first responder kind of character, or people at the school level who can address these harms in a trauma-informed way. And so I think there are huge areas for development in addressing, in particular, deepfake sexual abuse.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, it is heartening to hear that there are things being done out there. I think that Katie, of course, is someone who is obviously involved in kind of the legislative and at the grassroots sides of things. And so I'm sure that she might also have something to say about that. If not now, then perhaps later. But
I would go back to two important things you said, Sophie. One is definitely I'm working on a daily basis to try to increase the commitment to proactive education at the middle school. In fact, an all-boys school. Just, this is interesting for you, but also for our listeners. Sophie, I'm speaking at an all-boys middle school. They go from pre-K to grade 8 in California because of this exact issue. Two of their boys made deep fakes of girls and thought it was a joke and didn't even understand the ramifications. So I'm doing some of the work myself, although I might have to put you in my suitcase and unpack you and put you on the stage with me, because I think you'd be lovely to do this work with me, or you're doing it, but you could do it on a stage in front of lots of educators. The other thing I was going back to is, remember when we were talking about the different form of trauma that comes from this? To me, I was listening about oh my gosh, you can't control this. It can pop up anytime. It's stealthy. You have no control at all. And where my headspace went to this is kind of like trauma from being in a war. If you're living in a war zone, you don't know when the bomb is coming or when the enemy is going to be at your doorstep. And it's like you're hyper vigilant because you have absolutely no control. You happen to live here. And I'm wondering if any studies are being done to look at the type of trauma from those in constant, surveillance mode and trauma mode, and this kind of sexual exploitation where you were constantly, you never know how many people and you have no ability to control. It's out of your hands. And so I'm thinking there should be, if it's not been done, a study to look at any parallels in the experiences of those two types of people.
Yeah, I think, both of those examples really speak to this idea of having to self-surveil or self-censor or self-regulate constantly, whether that's from a physical trauma that could be about to happen in a conflict environment, or, I think when we think about sexual trauma and PTSD, we know that sexual trauma comes in conflict zones, right? That conflict zones are key spaces for gender-based violence, and we talked about that earlier for different reasons why. But I think, it makes me think about the way that women and girls and gender minoritized individuals are expected to self-surveil their own bodies, and how much that especially feels like that for everyone during adolescence as well, as a kind of key time and space of constant self-surveillance around your bodies. And in terms of my own dissertation research, one of the findings was this idea of presumptive exposure. So a lot of the adolescents that I spoke to, especially girls and feminine presenting individuals, was this idea that like, oh yeah, I'm going to get exposed. It's just about what, it's just a matter of when. And so every time the class beeper goes off, or cell phone or whatever, the student in the room thinking, oh, that might be me, they might have just found my nudes, right? So this idea of that constant feeling of being presumptively about to be exposed, I think absolutely is going to change the kind of psychological experience that people have in classrooms, in community spaces, in their own families, right?
Yeah, I almost put the hypervigilance as an experience of I can never relax. There's no place I'm ever safe. There's no time I won't be barraged with unexpected, atrocities, basically. And I'm really excited about everything. So, Catrina, we wrote down like we have 15 more minutes or so. Like, what else? I mean, obviously, Sophie, I think your research is critically important and groundbreaking. I know we have more questions, but think about what else would you like to share to inspire someone to follow in your footsteps, or do more work in this area? What are your cutting edge? What's your next step? What are you going to do?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I think something I'm really interested in is going back into the space of working directly with young people and families and schools.
All right. Well, then remember my suitcase.
Absolutely. I'm ready to jump in there.
You're right in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for continuing to take the journey on the Dear Survivor podcast. A quick note, we are 100% volunteer at the podcast and at Take Back the Night. Your donations, your generosity helps us do what we do on such a shoestring budget. And we would be so grateful if this show is helping you through your journey and you are passing it along to others you care about. Please visit the Take Back the Night website and donate and support our cause and our mission to end sexual violence and support survivors. Thank you. That's why, so we can talk about this with our listeners. Like, I fully believe in learning and researching, but I also believe in living the work. Like, when you hear the stories, when you hear what the sentences are that come out of someone's mouth, and the look on their face, and what their body language says, you get this whole sensory experience of what that trauma looks like in real time. So that's why I kind of like going and standing on that stage or in the auditorium. But so you're going to go back to the
I think what I'm really interested in is remaining in the educational nonprofit space, in the long term, and thinking about, what does it look like to be a school leader who's also creating response mechanisms for online harms happening in your school? What would it look like to be a leader at a college or a university and be trying to come up with trauma-informed protocols around addressing online harms in all the different ways they manifest? And so, I can give some thoughts around, one of the big questions that I get around my research is from parents who say, I have an 11-year-old, I have an 8-year-old, what do I do? What do I do? How do I talk to them about the internet? What do I do with devices? And I think, I'm not a parent myself. I like to preface this with that because I think it's, a really important thing to think about in terms of giving advice when you aren't parenting at home yourself and the challenges that come with that. But I think some of the important things are around kind of not having that knee-jerk reaction of like, I'm gonna take your cell phone away if I see something bad, or I'm gonna kind of creating a space around devices that is very contentious, even when that's coming from a place of trying to support your child. So things like starting open and curious conversations about how a young person is consuming the things that they're seeing online. So this makes me think about some research I did with a colleague, Fallon Parfait, about this TikTok trend that was really horrible about people pretending to punch their girlfriend. And then what we actually saw in some of the comments was that in some of the comments, people who'd experienced this in adolescent relationships, because adolescent relationships have these really high rates of conflict across genders, so girl on boy, boy on girl, they were actually using this as a space to like start conversations about it and say in the comment, this happened to me and what should I do and things like that. So a knee-jerk reaction might be, oh my goodness, my child is seeing this content, is going to harm them, but actually they might be looking at that content because they're trying to find spaces to have certain conversations and things like that. So I think being curious and open around internet usage and technology usage, and then just kind of having these broader conversations about self-esteem and body image and self-compassion that provide this protective kind of superpower for the young person when they are in online spaces where they might be consuming content or seeing content that is hypersexualizing or pornographic or disturbing, is coming in with that knowledge and that kind of self-empowerment around your own body. So for example, there's some really scary studies out there about the within a few minutes of going into social media spaces, adolescent girls are being targeted with, say, disordered eating content, and adolescent boys are being targeted with kind of incel type content, right? So then how do we kind of preemptively address that by having these conversations about gender equity and about body image and about self-esteem that kind of build folks up when they are exposed. And then I think a big area is, when young people experience harms or when young people accidentally perpetrate harms because they think it's funny, right? Going back to the example that you mentioned, how we can support them in a developmentally appropriate way rather than saying, you've just committed a crime, you've just committed this form of harassment or abuse, and punishing them in a way that they may not really understand the ramifications of what's happened. So we've seen different examples of both girls who experience image-based sexual abuse in the school environment being re-traumatized, right? Their name being shouted over the tannoy by the teacher to come and talk to the head teacher so everyone knows who it was, for example. Or, the person who committed the harm not being suspended. So then the message goes to the school that, like, this is something that young people can do and that it's not going to be punished. So we have to kind of create these mechanisms of accountability, but how do we do it at the family level and at the school level in a developmental way where folks are going to learn about consent and about refusal skills and things like that. So I think ultimately a lot of that comes down to setting, clear and shared boundaries together around technology usage and keeping lines of communication open around what young people are seeing. And I think that those are kind of useful things to consider in a family or a school environment.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. That sounds like such a great plan, a great thing to focus on, kind of like starting young. I also like the point you made about how not to have that knee-jerk reaction to technology and paint it automatically as this bad thing that should be eradicated. Because reading your work, it's very obvious that you're not a Luddite. You're not saying that like social media is bad. We need to get rid of it in order to get rid of cybersexual abuse. But it can be a platform for good and for sharing that these experiences that they may not know anybody else, any other adolescents in their lives, or any people to talk to about. So yeah, I really liked how you were able to present the way that, or this really nuanced approach to technology in creating these boundaries and safer spaces. And just kind of looking at the clock here, I think that what we have time for is just for any final messages for listeners of this podcast who are victims of cybersexual abuse, either on its own or in connection to other forms of abuse. Do you have any messages for them, as well as for allies or people who want to support survivors?
Yeah, I think, first of all, you're not alone. And, what you've experienced is a form of sexual harm and sexual abuse, right? I think, obviously it depends on the individual experience, but there is this normalization. People get creepy DMs all the time on Instagram and think that it's normal and things like that, because that is the world that we're living in. But it's not okay to consume, experience things online that make you feel uncomfortable, whether that's a small thing, well, not a small thing, but whether that's a daily occurrence that some adolescents experience, like a quote unquote creepy direct message, or whether that's having images exposed online, right? Regardless of the scale, like, it's not okay. This is a public space that we're all expected to kind of take part in. And so we should be able to do that without experiencing violations to our privacy or our consent. So first, I would say you're not alone, and what happened to you isn't okay, and it's not your fault. I'm really encourage folks to reach out to image-based sexual abuse hotlines, to reach out to general hotlines related to to intimate partner violence. And even if, I think there are a lot of gaps in provision, right? Especially with new digital harms. So reaching out to survivors more generally, finding networks of survivors through podcasts like this or other environments, to make sure that, that even if you experienced a kind of weird online thing, then you haven't found anyone else who experienced that exact same thing. It doesn't mean that you're the only one. And it doesn't mean that, you did anything wrong or it's your fault. It's a case of, getting that support, even if it's not necessarily as easy as more established harms.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie. Those are such important words and affirmations to share with our listeners. So before I hand it over to Katie to close off, I just wanted to thank you once again for making the time to speak with us, speak with all of our listeners, and spread this very important message about this kind of underrepresented type of abuse, as well as just sharing your amazing wealth of knowledge. Now passing it back on to Katie to close us off.
Yeah, and I don't know that all of our listeners know, Sophie, how much research you've put out there. I know sometimes research articles are hard to have access to if you're not currently at a university or studying somewhere. But can you share just a couple of your favorite articles that you've written, just so that people might beg a friend at a university to have access? Some of your most favorite things you've done.
That's so nice of you to offer. I mean, I would definitely first say check out the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which is not my organization, but a great space for resources and support. End Tab, which is another space where organizations can find support. So if you're a school leader or you're thinking about, how you can create more resources and support for victims of cyber sexual harassment. In terms of my own research, I have a website with some kind of earlier versions of research papers on there, so folks can, which I'm kind of allowed to publish because they're not the final draft. So they're all available on my website. And, I'm really looking to move into implementation. So, if folks are interested in, working together, I'd love, working together on creating resources to support young people or adults. I'd love to hear from folks.
Thanks so much, Sophie. And I know people will definitely go and find out more about you and your work and hopefully join the cause. So with that said, Catrina, I'm delighted to have you as a co-host today. And Sophie, I am looking forward to your next steps in life and in all your work to change the world to be a better, more respectful place. And for our listeners, we hope that you found something here in this conversation today as one more placeholder in your journey that you can take and think about, or just, know again that there's all these different types of trauma and that there are so many people who experience, various forms. And there are a lot of folks out there like Sophie trying to help end this problem, or at least point a better pinpoint light on it. And finally, I always like to mention the legal support hotline. If at this moment you're like, oh my gosh, because all the things we talked about today are also actionable, like potentially criminal and or civil laws would help you seek justice and find, accountability for the perpetrator. So don't forget about the legal support hotline on the Take Back the Night site. And otherwise, together we are thriving and surviving. Until the next episode, be well and take care. Thank you again, everybody, for joining another episode of the Dear Katie podcast. I hope very much you found today's episode helpful, empowering, and a way to take another step in that long journey toward healing and supporting those we care about, learning about sexual violence prevention, and also survivor support. For those of you who don't know, again, the Take Back the Night website has tons of great resources, books, self-care options, cool merch. If you're feeling like you need a wearable, we have great t-shirts. Of course, we would love it if you follow along on our free newsletter with news and events going on around the country and even around the globe. And finally, don't forget to like us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You'll find our entire community popping up here and there, and recaps of our podcast episodes as well. So together we shatter the silence, and together we end the violence. Take care.